A young girl sold her artwork to pay for her chemo, hoping for a miracle. But then Elon Musk walked by, and what he did next left everyone speechless. Let's find out how one moment changed everything.
When Elon Musk strolled past a busy art stand on a city sidewalk, most people didn't even notice him. Just another passerby, just another face in the crowd. But when he stopped, picked up a painting, and quietly listened to the girl in front of the stand, everything changed, because this wasn't just any artist. Grace Williams was fighting for more than just recognition. She was painting to save her own life, and what happened next became an unforgettable moment. Because in true Elon Musk style, he didn't just buy a painting, he changed her future forever. It was a dim, sterile room where the fluorescent lights above hummed softly, casting a pale glow over the white walls. The smell of antiseptic clung to the air, mixing with the faint beeping of monitors from the next room. Grace Williams sat on the crinkled hospital bed, her hands curled into tight fists in her lap. Across from her, Dr. Patel adjusted his glasses, his expression carefully neutral. Grace already knew what was coming. She had heard this tone before, gentle, practiced, the kind doctors used when they were about to deliver bad news. "The treatment is working," he said, a small glimmer of hope in his voice. "But you'll need at least 2 more rounds of chemo." Grace barely flinched. She was used to this routine, the pain, the sickness, the exhaustion. It had become part of her life now. What she wasn't used to was what he said next. "I understand your family is struggling with the costs. Unfortunately, without insurance coverage for the next round, the out-of-pocket expenses will be," he hesitated, then sighed, "substantial." Her mother let out a shaky breath beside her. Grace didn't need to look at her to know she was fighting back tears. The medical bills had already drained them dry. Their savings were gone. The last round of treatments had pushed them to the edge, and now this. For the first time in a long time, fear crept into Grace's chest, not of dying, but of watching her parents lose everything trying to save her. The drive home was silent. Her mother gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her father's voice had been hoarse when he told her everything would be okay, but Grace could hear the lie in it. That night, lying in bed, she stared at the ceiling, heart pounding. She refused to be a burden. She refused to let her parents drown in debt because of her. And that's when it hit her. Art. It had always been her escape, her passion. If she could create something that mattered, something people wanted to buy, maybe she could fight back in her own way. By morning, Grace had made up her mind. She wasn't going to wait for a miracle. She was going to make one. The first stroke of paint always felt like magic. The brush glided over the canvas, leaving behind soft blues and bold strokes of orange, the colors bleeding together to form something new, something alive. Grace sat on a foldable stool, her art stand set up on a bustling downtown sidewalk. The small wooden table in front of her was covered in neatly arranged canvases, each one a piece of her soul. Her mother had helped her set up the stand that morning, but the rest was up to Grace. It had been her idea after all. She had spent the last week pouring every ounce of energy into her paintings, knowing this wasn't just about art anymore. It was about survival. If she could sell enough, if people saw value in what she created, maybe, just maybe, she could afford the treatment that could save her life. But hope was a fragile thing. Pedestrians walked by, some glancing her way, others barely noticing. A woman in a navy blazer slowed for a second, admiring a canvas before shaking her head and moving on. A man in sunglasses and a tailored suit stopped long enough to read the small handwritten sign in front of her booth. "Original art, funding my cancer treatment." His mouth pressed into a tight line. Then he turned and walked away. Grace exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of the table to steady herself. The heat of the afternoon pressed down on her, making her dizzy. It had been hours and she hadn't sold a single piece. She reached for her water bottle, hands trembling slightly as she took a sip. Fatigue gnawed at her bones, a cruel reminder of what she was up against, not just the world but her own body. But giving up not an option. She forced a smile as an elderly couple approached, the woman's eyes bright with curiosity. "These are beautiful," she murmured, running her fingers lightly over the edge of a canvas. It was a piece Grace had poured her heart into, a vast desert sky painted in deep purples and streaks of gold. "How much for this one?" Grace swallowed. $80. The woman shared a glance with her husband, who nodded. "We'll take it." For a second, Grace didn't move. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind, but now that it was happening, she felt frozen. Then, as the woman handed her the cash, something inside Grace cracked open. The first sale, her first victory. She held on to that feeling as she packed the painting into a paper bag. The couple walked away, leaving Grace with $80 and a renewed sense of purpose. Maybe she was just one girl selling art on a street corner, but she was fighting, and she wasn't done yet. The city was alive. Street musicians strummed guitars on the corners, their melodies blending with the distant hum of traffic. Tourists wandered past, snapping photos of murals painted on the sides of old brick buildings. Businessmen, glued to their phones, brushed by without a second glance. Grace sat at her small table, hands resting on her knees, watching the world move around her. It was strange being surrounded by so many people, yet feeling invisible. She had sold one painting so far, one. Every time she saw someone glance her way, hope flared in her chest. Maybe this time, maybe this person would stop, admire her work, see her not as a girl begging for charity, but as an artist. Most didn't. Some slowed their pace, their eyes flicking to the canvases before walking on. Others barely noted her at all. And then there were the ones who did stop, but only to offer pity, not support. A middle-aged woman in a floral dress sighed as she read Grace's sign. "Oh, honey," she murmured, voice thick with sympathy. "I wish I could help, but I just don't have the money." Grace smiled politely. "That's okay. Thank you for stopping." The woman lingered, her gaze heavy. "You poor thing, you must be so brave." Brave, that word again. She had heard it so many times since her diagnosis, but it never felt right. She wasn't brave. She was desperate. She was tired. Still, she nodded, let the woman offer her soft words, then watched her walk away just like the others. Not long after, a different kind of customer showed up. A man in a leather jacket, sunglasses perched on his head, sauntered up to her stand. He eyed the paintings for a moment before letting out a low, amused scoff. "Nobody buys real art anymore, kid," he muttered. "You should try selling prints or, I don't know, TikTok commissions." Grace's hands clenched into fists. She bit back the sharp response on the tip of her tongue, swallowing the anger that burned at the back of her throat. She had dealt with people like this before, people who didn't understand, who thought dreams weren't worth chasing. "I don't need your advice," she said simply. "I just need to fight." The man snorted. Didn't argue. He walked away, blending into the crowd. Grace let out a slow breath. She refused to let frustration win because somewhere in this city, maybe today, maybe tomorrow, someone would see her, and that would change everything. By the fourth day, Grace was exhausted. Her body ached from sitting on the hard metal stool, her muscles weak from chemo treatments. The summer heat pressed against her skin, making her dizzy. She had sold 3 paintings in total. It wasn't enough, not even close. She tried to stay optimistic, but the weight of reality was creeping in. Maybe the man in the leather jacket was right, maybe no one cared. And then, out of nowhere, someone stopped. Not just any customer, a journalist. She was young, maybe in her late 20s, carrying a notebook and a press badge clipped to her back. Her dark brown hair was tied back in a loose ponytail, and her eyes lit up as she took in Grace's stand. "This is beautiful," she said, gesturing toward a canvas of a twilight cityscape. "Did you paint all of these yourself?" Grace blinked, nodding slowly. "Yeah." The journalist smiled, pulling out her phone. "I run a small online arts blog. I love finding hidden talent in the city. Mind if I take a few photos?" Grace hesitated. "Wait, really?" For the next few minutes, the woman took pictures of the paintings, of Grace sitting at her stand, of the small handwritten sign explaining why she was selling them. Then she asked the question Grace wasn't expecting. "What's your story?" So Grace told her about the hospital visits, about the medical bills piling up, about how she refused to let her parents struggle alone. The journalist nodded thoughtfully, jotting notes in the corner of her notebook. "People should hear this," she said. "I'll make sure they do." Grace didn't think much of it. People made promises all the time. But the next morning, when she arrived at her stand, something was different. More people were stopping, not just to look, but to buy. A woman bought 2 paintings in a row. A young couple flipped through her canvases, debating which one to take home. By noon, she had sold more paintings than she had in the last 4 days combined. Then her phone buzzed. It was a message from Lucas, her best friend. "Dude, check this out." She clicked the link. It was an article, her article, Fighting for Art, Fighting for Life. The teen who's painting her way to chemo, and at the bottom, thousands of shares. Grace's heart pounded. This was real. But even then, she didn't know just how big this moment was about to become because her biggest customer yet. He was already on his way. The afternoon sun cast long shadows over the sidewalk, stretching past Grace's stand as another wave of pedestrians rushed by. The city was a blur of movement, people lost in their own worlds, their own problems, their own distractions. Grace wiped the sweat from her forehead, trying to ignore the dizziness creeping in. Her body was screaming at her to rest, but rest wouldn't pay for chemo. She exhaled, adjusting the small stack of paintings on her table. The feature in the arts blog had helped, sales were picking up, but she was still far from her goal. And then, without warning, the energy around her shifted, a quiet presence, a stillness that felt out of place amid the city's chaos. She felt it before she saw him. A tall, older man had stopped at her stand. He wasn't like the others. He wasn't glancing at his phone, wasn't rushing to his next meeting. He stood completely still, hands tucked into the pockets of a weathered leather jacket, a cowboy hat tilted low over his face. He was studying her paintings, not just looking, but really seeing. Grace barely paid him any mind at first. She had seen all kinds of customers, curious tourists, skeptical businessmen, distracted shoppers who pretended to be interested only to walk away. But this guy, something about him was different. She was too tired to place why. "See anything you like?" she asked, her voice hoarse from the long day. The man smirked, just a little, just enough for her to notice. "Depends," he said, his voice gravelly, slow, unmistakably familiar. "What's the story behind these?" Grace hesitated. Most people asked about the prices, not the story. She glanced at him again, properly this time. His face was lined with age, but his piercing blue eyes held something sharp, something steady, like they had seen 100 lifetimes and still weren't easily impressed. Something about him felt like an old western come to life. She cleared her throat. "I paint because I have to," she said simply. "It's the only thing I can control right now." He didn't blink. He just waited, letting the silence do the work. So she told him about the diagnosis, about the ticking clock the doctors had given her, about how every brush stroke, every sale, wasn't just about survival, it was about taking back her life. And when she finished, the man didn't offer sympathy. He just nodded, and then he reached for a painting. The man lifted a black and white canvas from the table, tilting it slightly in the light. It was one of Grace's favorites, a vast desert landscape, the silhouette of a lone cowboy standing in the distance, the contrast between light and shadow, the endless sky above. It had taken her weeks to perfect. The man studied it carefully, then with a slow nod, he spoke. "I'll take this one." Grace barely reacted at first. She had done this a dozen times before, customers picking a piece, handing over cash, walking away without a second thought. She swallowed, running a hand through the back of her short, cropped hair. Okay. It's $200. The man didn't even reach for his wallet. Instead, he pulled out a checkbook. Grace blinked, thrown off by the unexpected gesture. No one carried checkbooks anymore. She watched as he uncapped a pen, his movements slow, deliberate. He scribbled something down, tore the check from the book, and handed it to her. She took it hesitantly. Her fingers barely gripped the paper, and then she saw the number. Her breath caught in her throat. Her vision blurred at the edges as her eyes locked onto the check, onto the impossible amount written in neat, bold handwriting. Not $200, $50,000. Her hands started to shake. "This," she whispered, barely able to form words. "This can't be right." The man smirked, tilting his hat back slightly, finally revealing his face fully. Grace's heart stopped. Elon Musk, the legend, the icon, the man whose films her dad had made her watch growing up, the man whose stare alone had defined generations of cinema. And here he was, standing in front of her, buying her art. No, changing her life. She couldn't breathe. She started, shaking her head in disbelief. I can't take this." Elon's eyes didn't waver. "It's not charity," he said. "It's a damn good painting." Grace felt like the ground beneath her had disappeared. People were staring now. The few pedestrians nearby had taken notice, their whispers growing louder. Someone pulled out a phone, snapping a picture, But Grace didn't care about the crowd. She looked at Elon, really looked at him, and saw something deeper in his expression, a quiet understanding. He knew what it meant to fight for something. He had spent his life doing it, and now, in the middle of a busy street, he had just given her a chance to keep fighting too. Her hands clenched around the check. For the first time in a long time, Grace felt. Then, later that night, she picked up a brush and started to paint. Her first official gallery show was set for the next month. Her inbox was flooded with commission requests. Her career was just beginning. But there was one painting she would never sell. The first one she had ever sold, the black and white Western landscape. It now hung in Elon Musk's private collection, a reminder that true grit isn't just in Westerns. This story was intense, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.